Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm very happy to welcome here on behalf of the State Library in our Wilhelm von Humboldt hall. And yeah, you can notice we need this big room today, this evening, tonight. And I'm very happy that this is the case. We have a very interesting and I think important event today. We open up our line of events, Europe and the United States in the shadow of war. And I'm very, very happy that we have good colleagues with us today, this evening, and for the whole series we make in the next weeks, conflicts in the end, the American situation, the election coming. We have the news of the day, of the next events in the US. We have the debate. We have an ongoing we Europeans, we Germans observe the American situation, and we are very, very keen and curious to get the information we need to understand what's in America going on. And I'm very happy that we will have tonight, more information on that, and especially we will come to the field of conflicts, of conflict resolution, of the situation of new coalitions in Europe. So Ukraine is in the middle of the interest we have, but I would like to welcome and to present to you the other partners of our partnership to have these events. First of all, I have to name the American Academy in Berlin, represented here by, I have to look by Daniel Benjamin, who will give a closing remark after the debate on the panel. But more in the focus should be Michael Kimmage, Professor Michael Kimmage from the Catholic University of America. He is a fellow, Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow of the American Academy, and we're happy to have you here. You will get more information on the colleagues here on the panel in the run of the evening. But I'd like to welcome you, especially that you've made a trip here to Berlin, and you will give us some inside talks. I think provocative ideas that will be debated afterwards. I saw that Alan Metzner, he charge d'affaires of the American embassy. Sorry, here we are, and we have had the luck that you come in just in time, that we welcome you here. Many of you know that the American ambassador, Ann Goodman, has stepped back, and her deputy is not in charge currently, so you are the highest ranking person here, and we are happy to have you here this evening. I'd like to note some other people will do here and will help you to govern the debate and to order all the things we expect. I think we have an introductory talk, and then we will have some responses. And I know, and I've learned, the ambassador of Ukraine is here, and that's a luck for us, Oleksii Makeiev. Maybe my spelling is not so well, but I'm happy that you're here, and I've accept something what you will present to us. And we're happy that a representative of the Swedish embassy is even here, Katarina Setja Aspring. I know that I'm wrong completely with my pronunciation, but I'm happy that you're here. And you help us with, the water you can have here, and you sponsor our nice event this evening. That's very great. I hope that I have all of our foreign guests now named, but I have to name Dr. Barbara Lippert. She is here as a director of research from the Academy of Science and Politics. She will give a response. I'm not really sure where she is. Yeah, wonderful. You come in a group of people, and this was too fast for me to notice, really. And Ann-Dorit Boy will moderate our event here this evening. This has been very helpful from the Spiegel. So we have a very nice round of people, some of them on the panel, some of them partly on the panel. And I hope that we have a very interesting and, I hope in the best sense of unnerving event this evening. Let me give some last word, and I would like to hand up this here. You find it outside in the tables, because as mentioned, we have a series of events. And just to mention that the last October day, the 31st of October, Halloween in US, we will have an event here in the Fontanesaal, directly in front of this room, in the other room, where Alexandra Hartmann from the University of Potsdam will give her contribution to this series, Europe and the United States in the Shadow of War, about whiteness in politics and culture in the US. This will be done in German, so today we will have this event in English and the other 3 events will be in German. Please take the card here, the postcard, to have an idea what we offer to you. The next event will be in November after the election in the US, so we can recalculate a little bit our opinions after the election in the US. Yeah, I'd like to welcome here now, I think you, I'm not sure, who will do the next step here on the panel, on the floor, which means, you will be the next one. I have no information on that, but I'm happy that you are here, and I welcome you again.
Good evening, and thank you, Deputy Director General Altenhöner, and the team at the library here for hosting this important event this evening. It is an honor to be here with you tonight to discuss the far-reaching impact of Russia's brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine on Europe and transatlantic security. Thank you also to Daniel Benjamin and the American Academy of Berlin, as well as to the Swedish and Ukrainian embassies for making tonight's event possible. I am also honored to welcome Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, Oleksii Makeiev, to the panel. Before arriving in Berlin 2 years ago to lead Ukraine's embassy, Ambassador Makeiev was the special representative for sanctions within Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, coordinating sanctions following Russia's February 2022 further invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador, the world has been inspired by the courage and spirit of your countrymen and countrywomen who have repelled Russia's vicious onslaught. They have further inspired as your fighting forces have retaken much of the territory that Russian forces seized in the first days of the war. We have all been horrified by Russia's heinous war crimes and atrocities, by Putin's blatant defiance of international law. None of us thought it possible that such crimes could be committed in Europe in the 21st century. The stakes in this conflict are nothing less than the defense of the free and secure way of life that we all value. We have stood by Ukraine as partners and friends as you have defended these values that unite people across both of our nations and around the world, and we will continue to stand with you. Ukraine needs our continued support now more than ever as it fights to defend the shared values of independence, freedom, and democracy. Let there be no illusions. Ukraine's struggle for freedom is our struggle. Vladimir Putin has made clear that his appetite for territory extends far beyond Ukraine. He seeks to redraw the map of Europe, subjugating more free peoples in the service of his malevolent mission to recreate the Soviet Empire. If history offers one clear lesson, it is this: appeasing dictators always incites further aggression. Our investment in Ukraine's security today is the only way to ensure we will not need to pay a far higher price in the future. That is why the United States, Germany, and our allies and partners have taken historic steps to support Ukraine as it fights to remain free and to protect its civilians against the vicious war crimes being committed by Russian forces. While the possibility of a $50 billion G7 loan to Ukraine, secured by the interest on Russia's frozen assets, is indeed promising, Ukraine's needs on and off the battlefield are vast. Ukraine supporters around the world will need to continue their bilateral assistance, as the U.S. has done, to ensure Ukraine can prevail in its fight for survival. As noted, our keynote speaker tonight is Professor Michael Kimmage, a professor at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and an American Academy of Berlin Fellow for fall 2024. Professor Kimmage is one of the most prominent U.S. commentators on Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. Between 2014 and 2016, he covered Russia and Ukraine at the U.S. Department of State as a member of Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff. After Professor Kimmage's remarks, we will hear from our panelists, Barbara Lippert, the Director of Research at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and Ambassador Oleksii Makeiev. Ann-Dorit Boy, who covers foreign affairs at Der Spiegel, will moderate the panel discussion. With that, I invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Michael Kimmage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very generous introduction. Thanks so much to the Stabi for hosting, to all of our sponsors, Frau Boy, Frau Lippert, Mr. Ambassador. It's an honor to share what's soon to be a panel discussion with you. And with that, I would like to delve into my prepared remarks for this evening. And what I want to address in some detail is a rather specific question. There are, of course, many possible questions we can review and consider when it comes to the war in Ukraine, which has global, transatlantic, European, regional, and local dimensions. But I want to look at the question of Russian motivations, which I think is one of the keys to the puzzle. And I will draw two conclusions from the subject of Russian motivations, but it's that I want to attempt to disentangle and present to you, both in 2014-2015, at the beginning of the war, and at the present moment. This is a separate question from the question of Russian capacity, and this, in a way, should be a source of some comfort to us, because Russia's motivations, its ambitions, are far ahead of its capacity, and at the same time, it should not be a source of too much comfort, because Russia's ambitions, as I will lay out in a moment, are expansive, and I think the best adjective you can use is radical. It's a radical set of ambitions. And it's also the case that Russian capacities are growing. Within the last 24 hours, there was just an announcement from the Kremlin about increases to the size of the Russian army. And Russia's defense industrial capacity, although it's being exhausted in some ways in the war, is also being replenished. So the ambitions are vast, the capacities are limited, but they are also increasing. I want to take a look only briefly at Russia's motivations vis-a-vis Ukraine. This is, of course, the heart of the story. It's the essence of the story. It's the most important aspect of the story, but I don't think it's the most complicated aspect of the story. I think we can state with some clarity what Russia's aspirations or intentions are vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think the more difficult nut to crack is Russia's ambitions or Russia's motivations vis-a-vis Europe writ large. So I'll say a few words about Ukraine, but I'll speak in somewhat greater detail about Russian intentions or motivations as they concern Europe. Russia, or rather Europe and the United States in the shadow of war. I'll kind of leave the United States off, but I think it will come in, by and by over the course of the evening. To start with Ukraine, I think it can be stated with clarity, with emphasis, almost with simplicity, that Russia's goal on the eve of the invasion, February 2022, was, in effect, to control the country, probably through this kind of scenario. This was the scenario that was evident in Moscow on the eve of the invasion in February 2022, which was to colonize probably half of Ukraine, or to install a puppet in half of Ukraine. And then with the other half of Ukraine, I don't think that Russia's ambitions were to control all of Ukraine's territory. It is, after all, a very large country. The intention was to immiserate the other half of Ukraine, to cut off access to the Black Sea, to make a kind of rump Ukraine as economically and demographically unviable as possible, and of course at the same time to make it a ward of the West. Now, this may sound like a totally unfeasible ambition. I think in the end it will prove to be, but that's, I think, where Russia stood at the beginning of the war. And I don't think that Russia's ambitions vis-a-vis Ukraine have moderated. If anything, I think Russia's ambitions may have mounted, become more ambitious over the course of the last 2.5 years. And so what Russia was driving for at the beginning of the war very much remains the thing that Russia is driving for at the present moment. And Putin wouldn't be increasing the size of the Russian military if he weren't aiming big in terms of these intentions. Again, the more complicated part of the story, I think, is the European part. And let me start an analysis of Russia and Europe with the hoped-for effects of the war, not the actual effects of the war, but the hoped-for effects of the war. I should say, as a kind of side note, this is the academic in me speaking, that when it comes to evidence about Russian intentions, Russian motivations, we don't have a lot to work with. Russia's a very hard country to figure out in terms of what it's actually up to, and a lot of this is inference and guesswork. It makes it interesting, but it also makes it difficult to say with certainty what the story exactly is. But this is the best guess I can offer in terms of what Russia thought the war would bring to its foreign policy, its vision of Europe when it invaded. We do know, I think this is close to a fact, that Russia expected the war to be short. They expected to have a quick victory. We know that Russian soldiers came, some of them with dress uniforms, for a parade that was being planned a week or two into the war. And you can take from this, you can extrapolate from this a certain vision of how the war might have affected Europe, a very short, bloodless war in which the Ukrainian state would have withered away, disappeared. Zelensky would have been captured, or he would have sort of run away in this way of looking at things from Moscow. And Europe would have been presented with something like a fait accompli in Ukraine. Not much bloodshed, in a way not even much military drama, but a kind of quick division carving up of the country. I think that Russia knew when it invaded in February 2022 that the United States would be deeply opposed to its actions. I think with the Biden administration, that's a fairly easy assumption to make. That's all of the signaling that was coming out of Washington before the war. So I think, the provocation of the United States is part of the intention on the Russian side. And I think with Europe, the hope was a kind of divide and conquer approach. Parts of Europe would be opportunistic, seeing that Russia had won the war in Ukraine so quickly, and would start to cut deals with Russia. Parts of Europe would be terrified, the Baltics and Poland, and would go, perhaps in a radical direction in their own right. And then parts of Europe would just be confused, Western Europe, Southern Europe, etc. And so this divide and conquer approach could have been quite useful. Again, it feels in retrospect like a fantasy, but I think this is what the fantasy was. And then the final piece of the fantasy is that if this had happened, if Europe had really fragmented and ruptured around its response to a successful Russian war, then what would have happened is a deep break between Europe and the United States. So Russia could have used this war, or could have used success in this war, to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States. That's the extent of the ambition that we're working with. Again, I don't have perfect evidence. We don't have policy papers from the Kremlin or the secret speeches of Putin that are going to help us to lay out exactly what he was thinking on the eve of the war, but that's the best I can do. And I think that that's where Russia stood then. It's quite important, if that's true, it's quite important to understand where Russia stood then, to understand where Russia stands at the present moment. As we know, this is moving from the fantasies that were there in the Kremlin to the ugly and brutal realities of the war. As we know, none of it turned out according to plan. I don't think any government could have planned a war of the kind that Russia found itself fighting within the first few weeks of the war. It was anarchy and chaos on the Russian side, And the results have been, in many, many ways, very dispiriting for Russia, something I think that we may be forgetting at the present moment as people understandably worry about the war, but perhaps define their position on the war a bit too much through worry. So not only has Ukraine resisted valiantly over the course of the last 2.5 years, but Russian quote-unquote progress in the war has been remarkably slow, best, I think, expressed through a statistic that in February 2022, Russia controlled about 11% of Ukrainian territory, or occupied about 11% of Ukrainian territory. Now that number is between 18 and 19%. That's, of course, 18 and 19% too much, but over the course of the last 2.5 years, given the loss of manpower and materiel in Russia, the enormous financial expense of the war, the on-paper advantages that the Russian military had at the beginning of the war, it is astonishingly slow progress. It's really not progress at all. We know, and we have people from the Swedish embassy here who can prove it, we know that Sweden and Finland became NATO member states in the course of the war. And although, Frau Boy, with all due respect to your profession, we know that sort of journalists focus a lot on transatlantic rifts. That's the story. That's the interesting story. When is it going to break apart? When's it going to fall apart? When's it going to finally be, sort of a collapsed relationship? That feels to me often the storyline that's embedded in a lot of journalism about the transatlantic relationship. But the actual fact, I would say, is almost the opposite. What you've seen is a very high degree of cooperation and partnership, not just in the transatlantic coalition supporting Ukraine, but in the global coalition supporting Ukraine, right? South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. It's not just a transatlantic endeavor, but the center has held in that regard. And that's not, of course, what Russia expected to happen at the beginning of the invasion. And then finally, it's no need to go into detail about this with a German audience, Russia has lost Europe in many respects as a market for its oil and gas, and also lost Europe as a source of investment in the Russian economy, which is really, among the many profound things that have happened with the war, it's really one of the most profound transitions. So all of that has been, I think, a series of setbacks for Russia in the war that it's found itself fighting. But I don't think, and this is the point that I'd like to emphasize, that this has resulted in a moderation of ambition in Moscow. As I said a moment ago, I think ambition, if anything, may be growing in Moscow. And so I think it's very important to lay out what the nature of that ambition is. And so let me offer you 3 points that describe current-day ambitions that Russia has toward Europe, based on the very, very messy war that it's been fighting over the course of the last 2.5 years. A core Russian goal with the war, this may have been true at the beginning, I think it's certainly true now, a core Russian goal is to demonstrate the futility of Europe as an actor in Europe and on the international stage, that Europe cannot solve problems, that Europe cannot deal with the realities of the war, that Europe cannot be the decisive factor, either militarily or diplomatically, in achieving victory against Russia or achieving victory in Ukraine. I think that there are secondary theaters for Russia in this regard. Another would be Syria. Another would be perhaps Sudan. You can point to other conflict zones where Russia has found it, or Putin's Russia has found it in its interest to demonstrate Europe's incapacity to deal with the international situation and the incapacity to deal with global problems. And here, since we are speaking about Europe and the US together, Russia's ambition vis-a-vis the United States is exactly the same, to demonstrate that the United States, not just a malign actor, that's of course the Russian sort of propaganda line, but ineffectual, unable to deal with the problems that are cropping up around the world. That's one, I think, very important objective. A second objective is rather abstract, but I think crucial to understanding the Russian war. And this is to define Europe not in terms of peace, but to define Europe in terms of war. So you have the famous phrase in American foreign policy, a Europe whole, free, and at peace, which stems from a speech that George Bush Sr. gave here in Mainz in Germany at the end of the Cold War. It's the Russian intention to show that none of that is true. Europe is not whole, it's not free. I don't know if that's crucial to Russia, but it's not at peace. And I think the logic here on the Russian side is as follows, that if Europe is to be defined through aggression, war, the revision of territorial borders, in a sense, much of what was rejected in Europe after the Second World War and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, then this is Russia's game and not Europe's. Europe's game is the game of integration, peaceful deliberation, rule of law, all of the things that the EU symbolizes. If that Europe is no longer there, Russia has certain built-in advantages. If it's rule of the jungle, then Russia is going to perform better than Brussels or Berlin or Paris or London. And I think there's a secondary ambition here of just making Europeans very uncomfortable with this situation, very uncomfortable with a situation where war is in the foreground. And I think Germany is the key country for Russia in this regard because of all European countries, for very understandable reasons. Germany is the least eager to be, how does one put it, a sort of robust military actor, either in Europe or anywhere else. So let's make it not Germany's game, let's make it our game. Finally, the third ambition, very general, big picture ambition, is to extract as high a possible price from Europe for its support for Ukraine. And here I think Russia has an array of options that it will pursue over the course, is pursuing already, but will pursue over the course of the next few months and probably over the course of the next few years. So targeted assassinations, that's of course a theme here in Germany, political sabotage, meddling, these are all familiar techniques that go back to 2016, even 2014, and earlier in some cases. The instilling of fear in Europe. So obviously there are, things that are overtly aggressive that Russia can do to try to impose costs on Europe, but the instilling of fear is a very particular cost. And so the nuclear saber rattling from Moscow, which sort of ebbs and flows, instills fear in European populations, and that becomes one of the costs of war, because fear has political consequences. That you can see in Germany, you can see throughout Europe, and you can see in the United States as well. The fear of war can lead to certain kinds of decisions, and in this sense, I don't think Russia feels like it has too much direct power to shape public opinion in a country like Germany. Certainly Russia cannot make European countries pro-Russian. That's of the past. But it can make them fearful enough that opposing Russia can seem like a bad idea. So this falls on the Russian side maybe somewhere between deterrence and asymmetrical war. And once again, there are a whole range of techniques that can be used to drive in this direction. Let me now draw to a conclusion with 2 points that sort of sum up, I think, what's significant about this topic of Russia's intentions and goals as they concern Europe. And none of it is about winning back Europe. I don't think that Russia can do it. There might be a government here or there that falls into Putin's pocket, but I don't think Russia can win back Europe. Instead, it's going to do something different. And so let me outline these 2 conclusions, and then I'm very eager to join in a conversation with our panel and our panelists about the implications of all of this. What is sort of preferable for Moscow during a long war is a long-term campaign to shift European public opinion away from support for the war, away from cooperation with the United States, and away from European cohesion itself, whether this means the integrity of the European Union or the integrity of the NATO alliance. Let me underscore again that this is not something that Russia is in and of itself able to do. It's not as if Russia has a tool that it can use to reach inside the body politic of Germany or of France or of the United States and just engineer outcomes. Russia doesn't have that capacity. If it had that capacity, it would use it, but that's not what Russia is able to do. What Russia is going to need to do is to take existing political phenomena that are useful to Russia and augment them, amplify them, give them sort of energy, give them purpose. And here it's necessary, this is I think a lesson that we can draw from the conflict itself, it's necessary not just to look at the battlefield of Ukraine, that's of course where everything really important is happening, but it's necessary or equally necessary to look within. To understand the course of the war, we need to look within the societies that we live in and try to understand what their sort of momentum is and direction, because sort of Moscow has lots of interests in that regard. And you could put it this way: to understand Russian foreign policy, in a sense, we need to understand ourselves. That's one conclusion I would draw from this story. Second conclusion I would draw from the nature of Russian ambition, the depth of Russian ambition, is that it suggests a particular time frame for the war. And I think we've all been too impatient for an ending to the war. 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. That probably is an inadequate time frame, or I think almost certainly is an inadequate time frame to understand the kind of challenge that Russia poses to Europe. The challenge that Russia poses is long-term, and it is structural, and this is the point that I would emphasize. It goes beyond Ukraine in the sense that Russia is eager to write the rules, to figure out, to have its say, to have its influence on the European order, on order within Europe. That's why I think Russian motivations at the beginning of the war are such an important topic. It was really about changing the European order and not just the situation on the ground in Ukraine. These two things are very intimately connected in Russian foreign policy and in Russian strategic thinking, changing the rules, changing the dynamic through long-term, sort of structural efforts to influence European politics and European security. That means, I think, that dealing with this challenge will demand enormous patience from Europe and from the United States, the ability to think in very long arcs of time, which is not easy for democracies, but it's certainly doable. It will demand from Europe that it not get distracted and not lose sight of the rather extraordinary challenge that it faces, long-term challenge that it faces in Russia. And here's my conclusion. It will also demand of Europe that it not underestimate the scale of Russian ambition and the scale of Russian ambitions, even when Putin seems impossibly far from achieving them. So not to underestimate the scale of ambition is in some ways the most important thing that we can do at the moment. With that, I would like to draw to a close and thank you for your attention and welcome my fellow panelists to the stage.
So good evening, everybody. First of all, I would, of course, like to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this conversation. And thank you, Michael, for an excellent, I think, analysis of what Russia is up to. I widely agree with your take on Russia's ambitions and motives, and that is why I would like to use the 5 minutes or so that I have to talk a bit about Europe and more specifically about the European Union in the shadow of the war. And I would like to bring up 2 questions. Thank you. First question is, what is the EU's response to the war? I think that since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the EU has undergone a lot of changes and at remarkable speed. So in a way, it was a disappointment for Russia that the EU has, within its limits, proven the capacity to react to the challenge. The EU is still united against Russia's war of aggression. It is standing together in support of Ukraine. It concluded a document together with Ukraine on joint security commitments, and there it is stated that the EU will support Ukraine as long as it takes and as intensely as needed. And I think that is a pledge for the future, and we'll see how it will work out. The EU, you all know, that has released comprehensive sanctions which were aimed at effectively reducing Russia's ability to continue to finance its war, only with mixed, I would say, results. The EU is providing constantly military assistance, which is quite new, that the EU entered into a scheme of joint procurement of ammunition and is reimbursing EU member states for their bilateral military support to Ukraine. The EU has put together financial support packages that also have a perspective to run till 2027 at least. So this is a way not only to support short-term measures and recovery of Ukraine, but it is linked to the perspective of Ukraine finally joining the European Union. And the war, and then the EU, is breathing new life into the stagnating enlargement policy of the EU. The EU is redrawing its relations not only with Ukraine, but also with Georgia, with Moldova. And it now thinks of enlargement, and that is, to my mind, a paradigm shift and change. It thinks of enlargement as a geostrategic investment in peace and stability in its own security. And it started with a country fighting a war against an aggressive neighbor, negotiations on membership. This is really something outstanding for the European Union, which had been hesitant to enter into any of these negotiations before. So there is now a feeling of geopolitical urgency. But on the other hand side, and when you look at the European Union, you always have to look at both sides. The other side of the coin is that the EU still follows its standard method of enlargement. When you look at the mandate that the Commission has to negotiate membership with Ukraine, you will see that there is no mentioning whatsoever of the state of war. So it's blind in a way, unmindful of the ongoing war when negotiating with Kiev. Second question is, what does this tell us about the European Union as an international actor? Are we witnessing now the emergence of the European Union as some sort of really geopolitical actor that could provide hard security? And when you think of where the EU started with its foreign and security policy, you see, of course, and Michael mentioned that the EU developed a liberal agenda and not a geopolitical one. And this liberal agenda made the EU a very strange animal in international politics. It was an exceptional actor, and now maybe we see a sort of normalization. At least some of the member states will strive for it. Let's see whether they are successful or not. But the times are not anymore there that you can talk about interdependence, political, economic interdependence by and multilateral cooperation. The whole international scene is now dominated by rivalry, contestation, zero-sum relationships. And you could say security is now everything, and deterrence and containment. And that is quite a different playbook for the European Union. And I think it's a very open question whether the European Union can actually become this sort of player. Of course, Commissioner von der Leyen, she talks about the EU as intrinsically a security project, which rings a bit strange in our ears, at least in Germany, where we were used to talk about the European Union as a peace project. So this is really a change of roles that would be one of the implications for the European Union to live up to this. So one could say Zeitenwende meets finally also Brussels. The EU is, that's my interpretation, in the midst of this kind of transition with an open ending. Of course, it now has to operate for the foreseeable future, and Michael pointed that very clearly out, in a hostile international environment with a clear challenger with all the ambitions Michael talked about that Russia has. And so far the war has been a catalyst, an accelerator to develop, I would say, untapped potentials of the security and defense policy of the European Union. The EU builds on its existing policies and instruments. It puts more resources into them. It is moving faster than before, and it has offered Ukraine several instruments in the field of military support, and at the same time the EU wants to expand, in particular, its European defense technological and industrial base. This is the starting point, the economy, as so often in the European Union, which still does not have, of course, an EU army. So it's the functionalist mode, we all know. It's not a quantum leap, so that the EU could really project military power. And I would like to stress that this rethink, as far as common foreign security policy of the European Union is concerned, started before 2022. And one of the drivers was, of course, the expectation that the US will retreat gradually from Europe and shift responsibility in security matters more and more to the Europeans. And today we see that this wake-up call was not enough for the EU to act faster, but nevertheless, I think there is now a real debate also within the European Union how to organize defense and deterrence. The EU still is in the shadow of NATO, which had its revival as a consequence of Russia's war, but we will continue to see the traditional divisions which are there in the European Union between Atlanticists, Europeanists, and recently also nationalists. And so I think it's also an open question, what will be the role of the European Union in the future European security order? And I think I stop here. Thank you.
Dear Michael, dear Barbara, dear Michael, thank you very much for setting the tone right at the outset of this discussion, because you clearly stated in your first introduction that the war started back in 2014. And this is very important to understand while we are sitting here in the center of Berlin and discussing the issues of peace and war. And compare it to realities back home. Just over this weekend, a very renowned group of people have been discussing the situation in Ukraine, this war, at the Yalta European Strategy Forum in the center of Kiev. And they sat in a beautiful environment there, but underground, and there were air raid sirens, and all the participants hid in that venue underground and discussed about the war. So if you think that the feeling of those people discussing would be comparable with the feeling of many of here, you will be mistaken. And then I try to be undiplomatic today to make our discussion more interesting. And then if you will discuss the same questions about the ideas and the goals of Russia and the reaction of the West with Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, you will definitely hear very unpleasant things. They would definitely say, well, actually, the world failed to react to that barbarian war. And everything about Zeitenwende or sanctions or weapons supply or reshaping the way Europe and NATO reacts to this war, all those things are lame excuses, because the peace of today depends on the ladies and gentlemen in uniform at the front lines in Ukraine. And we need to understand that every assistance to those girls and boys is pretty much needed, that they hold this line against this barbaric Russian aggression. Both Ukrainian army needs ammunition and weapon to defend itself and our independence. Ukrainian people and civilians need to be supported in order to overcome the third winter, while Russia tries to destroy energy infrastructure of Ukraine and continue bombing civilian facilities. And the country, my state, needs also financial support just to function as a state. And I agree with you that many countries and institutions did a lot to adapt to those challenges, but unfortunately it has not become an issue of national security for many countries in Europe and for the United States. Because when I repeat this famous phrase, as long as it takes, to the soldiers on the front line, they start laughing. And they say, what do they think? How much time do we have for that, as long as it takes? We have no time left to wait for another delivery of ammunition, to wait for another decisions, whether tanks or long-range equipment would be delivered to Ukraine, whether Ukraine would be accepted as future EU and NATO members, whether the guarantees would be given, security guarantees would be given to Ukraine, and whether the sanctions, the next package of sanctions with few entities would be adopted by the European Union or NATO. Going from those soldiers who are fighting and who badly need that support into a more cozy diplomatic environment, I must repeat it once and more again, that we appreciate very much everything what the Western countries have delivered to Ukraine in support of those guys. And I have no more important job as ambassador as get more equipment, more weapons, more sanctions to help to those guys. But at the end of the day, I would really expect that our today's discussions, that decisions of political forces and the governments of European Union and NATO, of the Western world, realize that the major goal of Russia in this war is not Ukraine. Russia continuously says that this is the war against the West. So my call on you, please accept it as a war against you and not against Ukraine. And that's why I find remarkable that this title, Europe and the United States in the Shadow of War, includes me and my country as a part of Europe. But for Ukrainians, this is not a shadow, this is the war, and we are living today in Ukraine in the World War III.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to pick up right where you left, and I'm going to ask my first question to you, Michael. So You have said that the challenge that Russia poses will demand enormous patience. I believe in one article somewhere else in Wall Street Journal, you even called that Cold War style patience. And I'm afraid my personal impressions, having been in Ukraine in August, in Kharkiv, I spent a couple of days on a military cemetery that used to be a civilian cemetery and was turned into a military cemetery for the reasons we all know. I don't think Ukraine can afford that patience. So while on a purely abstract level, I totally agree with your analysis, my impression is people are tired, are terribly exhausted, the toll is extremely high, not just casualties, civilian and military, but also things like the divorce rate, which is linked to the war, linked to the fact that families are separated, the birth rate. So I wonder, can we have that patience at Ukraine's expense, and what other more dynamic approaches are there other than patience?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Of course, by suggesting patience, I wasn't suggesting a kind of laying off of support for Ukraine, and I think that you can see an upward trajectory in military support from Ukraine from the beginning of the war that's quite dramatic, and I think you can see that upward trajectory is going to go forward now. National Security Advisor Sullivan spoke by video to the YES conference and was ambiguous about the provision of weapons, but the pattern is fairly clear, and I think there are lots of arguments you can make in favor of that, and that should be made in favor of that, and are not equating patience with passivity, but stalwart action in the spirit of patience. But there are sort of 2 points that I would make in addition to that. I don't think that the alternative to the current course of action is a negotiated settlement with Russia. I know that's not what you're proposing, and Mr. Ambassador, I don't think that that's what your government is proposing at the present moment, although it is a part of the conversation. I don't think, and it's just to repeat the point I made in my presentation, if Russia was moderating its ambitions, if Russia was willing to pull back, if it was willing to go in a different direction, I think there's a lot of negotiation that could happen, but I see no evidence of that. And in many ways, Russia is pushing forward with the war, and that to me suggests that a negotiated settlement is something that may never happen or is just very far in the future. But the second point to make is that, in theory, you can make all kinds of strategic pronouncements about what the West has to do, but it's limited by domestic politics. It kind of is what it is in Germany and the United States, and it's very clear from the U.S. presidential election that there are sort of two alternatives in the U.S. There's the status quo, represented by Biden-Harris, and then there's, probably a very diminished posture of support for Ukraine that's represented by the Republican Party. Those are the parameters of the American domestic political situation. So there isn't a big groundswell push to sort of double the military budgets for Ukraine, or to send uniformed American soldiers into Ukraine, or to allow strikes deep within Russia that might change the dynamic of the war. That's not a strategic point, but it's a very...
On that, we're reading in the news now every day the White House is poised to allow those strikes. What's holding them back?
Well, I think you have all of the things that they've said in the past about what's holding them back, and lack of clarity about what Russian red lines are, concern. I think this has been, sort of debated quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, that this means that a lot of the targeting would be done by the U.S., and so does it bring the U.S. in some ways very much into the war in ways that the White House is not comfortable with, but it's sort of clear that there's a pretty deep reluctance. And it's also clear, just to finish the point about domestic politics, that if Trump were to get elected, you wouldn't even be having that debate, right? You would know that it wouldn't be a permission granted to Ukraine. So there's an outer limit at the moment to American support for Ukraine, and we sort of have to work within that. And that's, I'm sure, absolutely maddening when you look at the situation from the front lines of Ukraine, but I think a relatively clear factor in the overall situation.
Mr. Ambassador, would you like to react to that? And maybe I add one point. I found it very surprising that our Chancellor Scholz recently said that now is a favorable time for diplomacy. Maybe I add that question. Would you agree?
Well, it's always favorable time for diplomacy, but what you mean with diplomacy? many people think that we need to just lay down our guns and go talking to Russia. What we are doing now together with Germany, with United States, United Kingdom, with G7 countries and EU and NATO governments is trying to build a big coalition of countries in support of the peace formula of the President Zelensky, 10 points plan of the president how to end this Russian aggression. And that's a hell's job to get. We have now 94 countries signed the declaration of the first summit held this summer in Switzerland. And we need to get more and more countries in support of that approach, of that peace plan, which is based purely on the United Nations documents, and is talking about the sovereignty and inviolability of borders, of food security, and nuclear security. So all those elements requires a 24/7 job of diplomats in Kiev, Berlin, and Washington. And this is what is diplomacy about. And the national security advisors, both of Ukraine and Germany, are standing in touch, trying to achieve next results on that diplomacy track. But once again, if you want at some stage talk to Russians, which Russians do not want to, is to negotiate with Russians from the position of strength. And you can show strength not drawing the red lines before yourself, but drawing the red lines before Russians. And we, as Ukraine, we have shown numerous times that we do not care about the red lines. And the last red line of Russia has been wiped off in the Kursk region.
Before I go to you, Mrs. Lippert, I would like to ask back. When we're talking about negotiations, has the Ukrainian position changed at all? So initially, the position, very understandably, was that Russia has to withdraw from all of Ukrainian territory and to return to the borders of 91. Has that position changed? I hear the rhetoric of the president has been a little, has a little bit softened on that.
Well, not at all. Ukrainian borders are defined in Ukrainian constitution. And once again, my call on the people trying to look at the map is not to look at this map as if you were playing the computer game of civilization, when you can just push the forces and then, wow, that's new borders appeared, or it's pity I need to give up that territory. It's not about territories, it's about freedom, and it's about people. Just imagine 20% of Ukrainian territories are occupied. And what happens there, the International Criminal Court will find out after we liberate those territories, and how many war crimes we will discover there. We have seen that after we liberated Bucha or Chernihiv or Izium or Kherson. So the unavailability of Ukrainian borders is a cornerstone of the peaceful resolution of this war.
As a journalist, I specialize in covering these occupied territories. As you know, we can't go there, so they're very hard to cover. We try to get in touch with people via social messengers, and sometimes we get something out. So I absolutely agree on that assessment. I'm not suggesting you should leave them to Putin, but in the process, there could be several steps being taken. Let me go to you, Mrs. Lippert. I was actually hoping you would be a little more optimistic on how Europe could step up. So if Trump gets elected, are we doomed? Is Europe then not going to be able to take up that role? You said, I believe, very questionable.
Well, as an academic, of course, I think you often don't know what the result will be, but we, of course, have some experience with the first Trump administration, and I don't think we're doomed. I think it will be even more of a challenge right now, and I also don't think that Trump will change everything as far as the US position and stance will be. But it will be tougher for us. The expectations are very high, and I think that many of the EU member states gradually realize that they really have to prepare, as Michael said, for a very, very long period of time to redirect resources. We will have a lot of domestic, I think, debate about the right priorities. But when we take our rhetoric in earnest, we have to say, if Ukraine fights our war too, and when it's about rule of law, when it's about democracy, we have to invest far more in defense. We have to reorganize our military capacities. We have to be far more efficient than in the past. We have to give up a lot of, let's say, traditional stances on industrial policies in the field of defense. And I think this is one of the major tasks, for example, of the next EU leadership. Von der Leyen, the Commission president, started years ago with the notion, this is the first geopolitical commission, and I think now we really have to implement policies to roll out what this means. And that is why I try to talk about also paradigm change, and this is really dramatic, what has to happen. And I think for some time, let's say, the US security umbrella will be there for us. I don't think that the immediate, but maybe Michael knows it better, the immediate step will be to leave NATO, for example, when Trump is the US president. But it is not anymore about burden sharing, it's about burden shifting to a considerable extent, and we have to accelerate. And that is, of course, within, let's say, the EU's constitution, a real challenge. There is not the hegemon like the US in NATO. We know US is the key actor in NATO. But in the EU, where is the political center? Who is leading the European Union in a legitimate way? So we need to really start and accelerate our debate about also our internal mechanisms so that we can really play this kind of role to deter Russia, to contain Russia. And I think that was your notion, that it will take a long time and this kind of patience that we need. There are no quick fixes and no, let's say, victories around the corner. So this is something to prepare for. And that is really a totally new ballgame for the European Union, which was, let's say, its architecture does not really meet these new challenges, its internal decision-making processes, but also its foreign policy identity. So this is really a big change ahead.
Thank you very much. And of course, as you've mentioned, we have the same internal politics issues that are putting a lot of pressure on our government at this point, are questioning support. We have parties on the left and the right extreme end of the spectrum that are demanding negotiations that would not be favorable to Ukraine. So that is obviously makes the whole situation even more challenging. Is there any hope in a Kamala Harris win? I mean, you seem to be implicating that this would be more of a continuation at best of what we've seen. Is there any potential for maybe more support for Ukraine?
Certainly. I don't think that it would be a sea change because, after all, Kamala Harris is the vice president, and so, she's of the process now, and I don't think that she would completely remake it. On the other hand, there's the expression that policy is personnel or personnel is policy, so it would be a new team to a great extent, I would assume, and that could generate certain shifts, particularly on this question perhaps of providing long-range missiles and allowing Ukraine to use them to strike deep within Russia. That's, I think, an open question with a Harris administration. Where I think a Harris administration might be quite different from a Biden administration is with economic statecraft. So there might be much more willingness, especially in the first 2 years, to go after Russian gas and oil and to exact higher economic costs for Russia for the war through that mechanism, because the Biden administration has been very concerned, understandably, for domestic political reasons about inflation. So they've capped some of the sanctions at a certain point. I think Harris would be freer to do that, and she might pursue that option. So not an entirely different war, not a different strategy, not a totally different set of tools, but there is the possibility, I don't know if escalation is the right word, but for a more robust policy.
I have promised to open this debate to the public early on, so now's the time. Someone wanted to come and get you a microphone, and then I'm happy to take the first questions. Wow, this is a tough one. So I think the gentleman with the glasses over there was the first I saw.
Thank you. My name is Gabriel Deutsch. I'm an attorney here in Berlin and not speaking on a specific entity's approach. So my question is sort of focusing back on what does this mean for Germany. We have seen election in Eastern Germany. There's another election coming up next weekend. And from what we see, Germany had been blind at the beginning in 2014 when this war started. We have now a situation where we talk about Zeitenwende, but at the same time, a large group in the general public is not in support of that, as we see from the results of the elections in Eastern Germany. So what is your point of view on how this will play out in the next months, and what is the role of this far left and also right parties in influencing the decision process in Germany? That would be my question. Thank you very much.
Who would like to take it, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, from any diplomat, it is expected that the diplomats do not interfere with domestic affairs, and this is what I'm not going to do to interfere. But when I see what the AfD and the BSW are trying to implore on their voters, is that Ukraine needs to go on compromise. And in the whole rhetoric of these parties, we can clearly see that they do not even bother to mention Russia, as if it is only Ukraine who is just conducting this war. And once again, my proposal to many democratic political forces here in Germany was: take me with you when you are going to talk with your voters, not as a part of electoral campaign, but as a part of explaining to the people why Germany helps Ukraine. And I think it requires a very deep and honest dialogue with voters or with populations. It's much easier just to throw a word peace, and then everybody would understand, okay, you are for peace, you're not for war, and that sells in terms of political campaign. I myself am not campaigning, but I go and visit different cities and villages of Germany, and I'm not shy to go into discussion with the people, because all those fears of a big war, of a nuclear war, of a war coming to Germany is a legitimate fear and needs to be addressed. So I hope that in 1 week everybody return to business and try to help Ukraine with new weapons and new policies. But I'm afraid from the beginning of spring, the whole Germany would then switch into the electoral mode for the elections to the Bundestag, and what we need and we Ukrainian expect from Germany is to take a leading role in building that coalition within the European Union and NATO, together with the United States, to make sure that war of aggression never happens in the 21st century.
I will take one question from this side now.
Hello. My name is Katja Garner. I have one short question to Mr. Kimmage and one short question to Mr. Makeiev. My question to Michael Kimmage is, as far as I remember, in 2000 and 2001, Mr. Putin reached out to join NATO. There were talks with the Secretary of State, Mr. Robinson, and I want to know what went so totally wrong after this. And my question to Mr. Makeiev is, what does Mr. Putin think of our concept of the United States of Europe? So we are so far the unfriendly states. Europe is the unfriendly state. So what does he think about our concept of the United States of Europe? And how does Russia see itself? Does it see as a part of European or as a part of Asian?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's an enormous one, and one could give a very, very long answer to the question of what happened within Russia, not to mention U.S.-Russian relations. So let me just touch briefly on, sort of a few relevant points. I would respectfully disagree that Putin suggested that Russia join NATO. There was a moment at the beginning of his presidency where he speculated about those kinds of things, and in fact there was a paper that my old office at the State Department put out, but sort of put forward internally in 2002, 2003, that speculated about what would it mean to have Russia join NATO. So it simply means, I think, at that period that a lot was still undecided, was wide open, and you could imagine very different scenarios and futures. And so the intellectual openness or imaginative openness of that period is an interesting historical data point. Of course, Putin begins as a kind of modernizer, and he does open a lot of doors to the West. I think we can say in retrospect that a lot of those doors were opened, and this is a very classic dynamic in Russian history, for the sake of Russian modernization and modernization of the military, to give Russia the role that it wishes to play in the region, which is very different, I think, from the kind of modernization we expected Russia would pursue. But I think the answer resides, in some things like the Iraq War, which Putin really didn't like, and that did sour relations, and you could hold the U.S. responsible for that. But I think the way in which Russia evolves into a dictatorship with highly aggressive regional ambitions, not just in Ukraine, but also Moldova, Georgia, and other places, is just the real story of the war. And at the same time that you can find these quotes from Putin about NATO and about how he wishes to be a Democrat and a European and a Westernizer, you can find all kinds of quotes about the kind of regional entitlements that Russia has that take us back to Yeltsin and the 1990s, and are the long background to the Russian invasion in 2014 and then the massive invasion in 2022. So it's not a linear story, it's a highly complicated one, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that period of flexibility and fluidity. It's just an interesting counterfactual at the moment, but I think not too much more than that.
Well, I would not be able to translate or to get into the head and to the brain of Putin. But what I know, that Russia is an empire, and Russian people are still living in an empire, Soviet empire or Russian empire. And a clear goal for Putin is to restore this empire. And empires have unfortunately nothing to do with freedom and democracy and the rule of law and the human rights. All those things which constitutes our European values. Exactly that's why all the Russians hate Westerners. They call it in Russian language gay Europa. So they hate those freedoms. They despise Europeans for that freedom, even for freedom of your sexual orientation. This is not compatible with what this empire is about. So my call on you is never trust and never take seriously what Russia is saying, and unfortunately never sign any documents with Russia, because they are not worth the signature below that.
On this side, I see a blonde lady in the row 5, I believe.
Thank you very much. Excellency, please, I would like to know why are you, Ukraine and the others, so pessimist with the effect of sanctions? We have in the EU, now this week, the dependence of fossil from Russia is from 45% to 15%. I don't think that 30% from business with fossil, with EU, is a little for Russia, and so on and so on. Anyway, why are you so pessimist with the effects of this?
No, I'm absolutely not pessimistic about the effect of sanctions. Sanctions are working, and those sanctions which have been introduced by our partners, now we're talking about 15 packages of European sanctions, and if we add all the packages from other countries, from the US, from New Zealand and Australia, that's a serious work behind this, and Russian economy is of course struggling. But unfortunately, from the very beginning, and I've been a part of the sanctions team in 2022, unfortunately we could not reach an agreement to switch off the SWIFT for bank transfer for Russia, which would be a major blow. We have negotiated for a year about introducing sanctions against gas and oil supply, and unfortunately it has not been agreed by the European Union, and that was a good step of Germany to get rid of the Russian gas, but that was not an unanimous decision of the West. Sanctions are working, and our sanctions team are now trying to make even more economic pressure on Russia. The more pressure, the more powerful our position for negotiations with Russia. I repeat, Russia needs to be negotiated from a position of strength.
I have a lot of people to choose from. It's hard. Okay, I'll take this lady over here to stick to my one side and then the other side rule.
if everybody talks about, my name is Uschi Eid, I'm the president of the German Africa Foundation. Mr. Ambassador, you talked about the declaration or the resolution from the conference in Switzerland, which is signed by 94 nations. Now, the United Nations have 193 nations or members. So 94 is quite a lot. But when I recall the speech of the Kenyan ambassador in 2022, he spoke for the Africans and he mentioned the principles of the Charter of the Organization of the African Union, where the sovereignty of the states, the untouchable of the borders, and and integrity of nations are really enshrined in that charter. It would be good if in such a peace plan one could also refer to the Charter of the OAU, because then it might be that more African states, which are a third of UN membership, they are 54 members in the UN, so then you could have also more states from the south, specifically from Africa, also supporting this resolution in Switzerland, which you said is enshrining the plan of your president for further peace negotiations. So that was just a suggestion.
Thank you.
I allow myself to make. Yeah.
Thank you for your idea. I will take it on board. I don't have now a figure of how many African countries supported the declaration, but indeed, you're absolutely right. We need a tailor-made approach to every country. And this is what we are trying now to do. We are expanding our diplomatic presence. There were several visits of our foreign ministers and special envoy on Africa, and we are willing to make a Ukraine-African countries summit soon to address those countries and to take them on board. Absolutely, a tailor-made approach, a diplomatic work will be held in every region with assistance of our friends who are maybe better linked to African, Asian, or Latin American countries. And this is what diplomacy is about. Whenever you hear there is no diplomacy at all, and we need more diplomacy, a huge diplomatic effort is being coordinated with Ukrainian and partner states.
I'll take a question from the very back, the lady with the glasses back there.
Thank you. My name is Ayla. I'm a doctoral researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin and also Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Fellow. My question is regarding NATO membership, and do you believe, Mr. Ambassador, would there be any NATO, let's say, conversations while having peace negotiations with Russia? Would that be on the desk? Also regarding NATO membership, do you believe that Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo joining NATO would, let's say, affect in somehow the full-scale Russia's invasion to Ukraine and war itself? Would that, let's say, help with the negotiations, peace negotiations, and would that actually foster peace? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I would also love to have Michael's view on NATO. From what I can tell, that we have in Europe, we have understood very clearly that there is no better security guarantee than a NATO membership. Go ask Finland and Sweden. As we make jokes in Ukraine, well, actually, Putin can be rewarded by the NATO for NATO extension. NATO expansion by these two countries, the thing that he wanted to stop at any cost. And I'm absolutely sure that any country which qualifies to be a NATO member would make our continent more secure. And one important observation, actually, Ukraine is doing today alone the thing that for what NATO has been created back in the 40s, to protect Europe from a Soviet aggression, and will make it alone without proclaiming the Article 5 provisions. But we need to ask ourselves, would it contribute to our security? Because when I'm observing the internal German debates on NATO, it looks like NATO is something bad. People living here do not realize that they feel secure and there are no Russian rockets up in the skies and falling on their heads, because you are a part of NATO and because you have a great men and women in uniform at the Bundeswehr who are protecting you 24/7. And I think the same question shall be posed to every European society. Why do you feel that secures, and what is your contribution to your security? But Michael, what's in the U.S.?
Sure. Just to go back to the question for a moment, it seems to me very improbable that NATO membership for Ukraine could be parts of negotiations with Russia to terminate the war. I don't think that that's anything that Russia would agree to, unless it was massively weakened by something within or on the battlefield, which is of course possible, but not the short to medium term story. One would have to presume. I think in the U.S., probably what President Biden has said repeatedly is the most important thing, which is that NATO membership is a possibility only when the war is over. I would be surprised if President Harris would think very differently about that. But going back to the question about President Harris, that might be there might be a different calculus or a different time frame. Of course, Secretary Blinken has spoken repeatedly and with emphasis about NATO membership for Ukraine. So I think you can say two things in the U.S. case. The language has changed, profoundly. If we go back to 2014, 2015, the problem was there with the annexation of Crimea, Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine, but there was no serious conversation then about Ukraine becoming a NATO member, despite promises that had been made in the past, and that is now very different. So I think, Mr. Ambassador, your country has much more to work with in that regard in Washington. But the second point I would make is that from a U.S. perspective, I don't think the kind of all or nothing NATO debate is maybe the first debate that has to be had, and certainly not the only debate. I think what the U.S. can do is, and Britain I think is inching in this direction, is a graduated series of security commitments to Ukraine that perhaps in a formal sense fall short of NATO membership, but begin to recreate the Article 5 commitment. And a bit as Barbara said about the European Union not being so well designed to deal with major wars and international tensions, NATO is not perfectly designed to incorporate a member that is at war. So I think that if we can find the equivalent of Article 5, and maybe it doesn't have to then go through the US Senate and be approved by every NATO member state, which would be another headache in this regard, if we could find the equivalent for it, then drive for that, because that to me seems achievable in the short to medium term. But NATO membership is going to be a stretch, and then of course if Trump is elected, I think it's probably dramatically more difficult in that regard. But one need not be, I think, especially pessimistic about that conclusion, because I think the equivalent could be constituted. In fact, you do see this network of bilateral security agreements that's forming between a series of European countries and Ukraine, including the United States and Ukraine, and I think that that's just the path forward in a practical sense.
And what's important is this path. NATO open door policy since 2008, when we signed, right? Was it 2008? Right, when we signed the documents on the possible future membership of NATO. So that was in the statement of allies, that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. This open door policy seemed to us Ukrainians as rather a NATO not yet closed door policy, because the door was never really open. And what we expect is to lay this path to the membership and say, we start preparing Ukraine for the membership of NATO. Here is the invitation. When it happens depends on many things, but I can assure you that in many aspects of military command structure and our compatibility and interoperability with NATO, we can be seen as a full-fledged member, the way of the integration of decision-making process, and how now a new assigned NATO assistant mission based in Wiesbaden would be coordinating the whole support for Ukraine to fight this war.
Thank you. So I've been asked to not let this go out of control in terms of all of your time, but I'll take 2 more questions. And this one here, right in the front first.
Hello, my name is Hilmar Werner. I am the initiator of a petition on Open Petition DE, a petition that's closed already, but still I'd like to present the basic message in short terms. It suggested a very unpopular double strategy. On the one hand, making Putin absolutely clear militarily and economically that he will not be able to win this war. Quite different to what we do right now, being hesitant, letting him the hope to maybe in the long run win the war. But on the other hand, the petition stresses that it is very important to understand that Putin cannot simply go home and say, we've lost, they won, and accept the Zelensky 10-point plan, Ukraine's 10-point plan, and say, okay, game over. Impossible. Because that means that Russia will be humiliated in their eyes, a people who every year sings the unofficial national anthem, Jуравли, the crane. The cranes, maybe you know it, if you don't know, listen to it. It is impossible for them to retire and be beaten. So there must be an offer made by the West that allows Putin to climb down from the tree, saving his face. And what could be such an offer? In my eye, a two-pronged approach maybe. On the one hand, a security zone, which takes up Putin's official reason for the war, that Russia's security interests are threatened by NATO. So maybe a demilitarized zone offered by NATO or the organizations of the West, or a zone armed only with weapons that can be used only for defensive purposes. And on the other hand, in the long run, a plebiscite solution for the embattled regions, a plebiscite solution, of course, under internationally controlled situation and after a re-migration of peoples into these regions. What would be your take on this unpopular double strategy? As you will know, we are very divided here. On the one side, people want to beat Putin militarily. On the other hand, they say no weapons and hope Putin will make peace. So that's another strategy.
Well, let me be honest with you. It does sound as if it would be the same situation if you suggest a criminal who raped your daughter not to humiliate him, to leave him free, and prohibit to your daughter to leave your house for the sake of security of everybody in the town. Do not be afraid to make justice to those who made thousands and thousands war crimes in Ukraine. Our societies are about justice and not deals with criminals. So this justice is needed to restore the belief and trust of our societies in democracy, and never go into that compromises, because unfortunately we have seen such compromises in the European history. Back with Chamberlain and the Munich deal, 2014, when everybody closed the eyes and said, okay, get that Crimea, Russia better get Crimea, we do not start a war, and further on and further on and further on, and everything on expense of Ukraine. So at least I've heard a peace plan from you. This is nothing what I hear from the BSW or IFD. All those people who are calling for peace plan, they do not propose anything. But once again, it would not work this way, because try to reproduce those funny and difficult diplomatic ideas and negotiations and make it something which is close to you personally or to your dear family. Then it would be clear that there are things you would never agree to.
I'm almost sad I declared this the last question already, but it has to be on this side now. Back there is a young man with glasses again.
I'm Dr. Gautam Chakrabarti. I work on the Cultural Cold War. I'm affiliated to the European University of Viadrina. If I'm allowed a very short compliment to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine, I've been noticing how you've been putting forth your country's cause in a very courteous, in a very civil, but a very proactive and spirited manner. For that, my humble compliments, Your Excellency. Without losing diplomatic courtesy, and I'm sure we all know what I mean. My question actually is to Professor Kimmage, a very short question. You mentioned that in a possible Harris-Walz administration, there may or may not be allowance for direct strikes deep into Russia. That is on the table, may or may not happen. But you talked about the possibility of oil and gas caps being lifted. Now, if we look at the transitional architecture that is in place between places like the Saudis in China, the Saudis in Africa, India and Russia, India and China. You note what happened a few days ago in BRICS. Who knows due to what negotiations India and China have substantially disentangled in the Himalayas. What precisely do you see leverage for a possible President Harris to tinker with oil and gas caps? What are the precise things she can do? Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the question. I don't really know what the precise things are that she could do. It's sort of beyond my immediate competence, and I don't want to pretend to more competence than I actually have. I'll just make two quick points in response to the general question, and in some ways it goes back to the point that was made about Africa and the states of Africa and the kind of global dimension to the war. One of the essential things in understanding this war, I would say, is to understand how effective Russia is in the global arena. And there are many ingredients of this effectiveness. I don't think that Russia has persuaded anybody that the war is a good idea, or that Russia is fighting a just war or fighting it without war crimes. I think people know those facts. But I think in a different sense, when it comes to the battle of hearts and minds, Russia has been able to say that other countries do what Russia does. This is normal. This is nothing out of the ordinary. And especially in the economic domain, Russia has been very effective. I agree that there are burdens on the Russian economy, but money is flowing in, and markets are opening up, and smuggling is going through Turkey and Georgia and Kazakhstan, and European goods that are sanctioned are flowing into Russia. Certainly the capital cities are very insulated from the war, but most importantly, Russia has the money to wage this war, and probably will for a long time to come. So even if Harris, maybe I'm going to sort of skip over the precise details, but even if the Harris administration would be very effective in ratcheting up U.S. economic statecraft, it wouldn't amount to all that much real leverage, so it would be a tweak. And that leads me to my final point, since it is the last question, that we can be very abstract and theoretical about this war. And I think when you look at the global dimensions, that's necessary, that's revealing, that's important. But the essence of the war is what's happening on the battlefield. So success will be achieved there. And to go back to the Harris administration, that's, I think, where the core emphasis should fall. So if the sanctions regime is not doing what we wish with Russia, there's a lot of drone production that could be done in Europe, in the US, and is happening already in Ukraine. There's a lot of capital that could flow into Ukraine to work on that. That's the kind of practicality of the battlefield. Defense industrial capacity for Ukraine is increasing. There are lots of ways in which a Harris administration could contribute to that. So, it's a possible tweak to policy, but the key thing for a Harris administration would be to focus on greater success on the battlefield, because that's the pivot point around which everything else revolves.
Thanks a lot to my panelists, and thanks to you all for bearing with us and asking such interesting questions.
Is this on? Thank you. I just wanted to, I'm Daniel Benjamin, I'm the president of the American Academy, and I just wanted to say what a fascinating, insightful, and wide-ranging conversation we've had here tonight, and I want to say how pleased we were that we could do it in the remarkable Humboldt-Saal here at the Stabi. First of all, I want to just thank Michael. He did a terrific tour d'horizon, and we're delighted to have you as the Holbrooke Fellow in residence at the Academy this semester. And for those who haven't had enough, Michael will be speaking again on Thursday at the Academy, so if you want to tune into that event, you're more than welcome. I also wanted to thank Ambassador Makeiev. Kyiv is really quite fortunate to have you here representing the Ukrainian case. Barbara Lippert, thank you very much for giving me even more hope about the future of the EU, even if there will be a lot of cranking and noise in the background as it adapts itself to a new era. And thank you, Ann-Dorit Boy, for excellent moderation and toggling well between left and right. I just want to, and I also want to say to the embassies of Ukraine and Sweden, thank you so much for supporting this event. I want to close by just saying how much I appreciated the remarks also of Sergei Alan Meltzer. There's just no question in my mind that the Ukrainians are fighting our fight, and they are on the front line against barbarism. And at a time in an era of exhausting perpetual elections, I hope we're all shrewd enough not to fall to the siren sounds of peace, as has been mentioned by some of the participants, and to think hard about who is protecting freedom and who is suffering the most to ensure that Europe and the United States remain free, independent, sovereign, and unintimidated. I just want to say also we have an enormous number of exceptional fellows in residence, virtually 11 other or 10 other Michael Kimmages in many different fields. So I encourage you to join us for their lectures. Please do have a look at our website. We'll cover topics from the quest for wisdom and good judgment to the history of snow, far-right movements, and environmentalism in the developing world, sound and multidisciplinary collaborations, and many others. Thanks again to the Stabi for hosting this. Thank you all for coming.